All right, so today we're going down a rabbit hole of legal filings, folks. And let me tell you, this one's a doozy. We're looking into a guy named Matthew Escalante who, and this is where it gets interesting, ended up with the court basically putting him on a tight leash when it came to filing lawsuits.
It's kind of a cautionary tale, but it also opens up this whole can of worms about people representing themselves in court, access to justice, and whether the system is actually set up to help the little guy.
Okay, you've definitely piqued my interest. Let's back up a bit. Who is this Matthew Escalante, and what kind of legal trouble got him into this mess?
So, we don't know his whole life story or anything, but we've got this stack of court documents from the U.S. District Court for the District of Kansas, and let me tell you, they paint a picture. This guy was tangled up in legal battles left and right, mostly stemming from a nasty divorce and a custody battle over his kids.
Family court. That's a minefield even with a team of lawyers on your side. But these documents, are you saying he was navigating this whole thing without a lawyer? Going pro se, as they call it?
You got it, representing himself. Which, if you've ever tried to, say, rebuild an engine with just a YouTube video and a rusty wrench, it can get complicated.
You don't have to tell me. It's like trying to perform surgery on yourself. You might have a general idea of where things go, but without the expertise, it's a recipe for disaster.
That's actually a pretty good analogy. The legal system, much like medicine, has its own set of rules, procedures, a whole language even, that you need to know to be effective. And without that deep knowledge, it's incredibly difficult to advocate for yourself.
Okay, so it's not exactly shocking that this lack of legal know-how might have played a role in how things shook out for Escalante. But before we get into all that, who are the other players in these lawsuits? The documents mention quite a few names.
It's not so much about the specific people, but more about the groups he was going after. We've got family members, mainly his ex-wife, Janelle Escalante. Then there's a whole slew of legal eagles, his ex-wife's attorney, the guardian ad litem assigned to the case, even the judges who presided over his custody hearings. And as if that wasn't enough, he also went after government entities like the Gardner Police Department and the city of Gardner itself.
Wow, he was really casting a wide net, wasn't he? It's almost like he was trying to hold everyone, even remotely connected to his custody case, responsible for what he saw as unfair treatment.
And that right there, that's a pattern you often see with people who represent themselves in court, especially when they feel like the system has chewed them up and spit them out. They tend to sue everyone and their grandmother, often out of pure frustration or because they don't understand how legal strategy really works. They see connections, conspiracies even, where a seasoned lawyer might say, hold on, let's focus our energy on the winnable arguments.
It's like that old saying, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Except in this case, Escalante's hammer was a lawsuit, and he was swinging it at anything that moved.
That's a great way to put it. But it's important to remember, these weren't just random legal temper tantrums. Escalante actually presented arguments, even if they were sometimes, shall we say, a bit out there, for every single lawsuit he filed. He truly believed his rights were being trampled on, and he was determined to get justice, or at least his version of it.
So let's talk about those arguments. What was the legal basis for Escalante's lawsuits? What wrongs did he believe had been committed? So let's talk about those arguments. What was the legal basis for Escalante's lawsuits? What wrongs did he believe had been committed?
Well, at the heart of it all, Escalante was convinced that the system had completely failed him. He claimed there was this whole pattern of misconduct, saying that people were making false accusations against him during the custody battle.
Oh, I see. So he felt like he was being painted as the bad guy, and that these accusations were unfounded.
Exactly. And he didn't stop there. He even went so far as to say that investigations were mishandled. And get this, he actually argued that a protection from stalking order that was against him was totally bogus, totally void, as he put it in the legal filings.
Void. He sounds pretty fired up.
Yeah.
Did he ever lay out exactly how his rights were being violated, or was it more of a general feeling of being wronged?
Well, he did repeatedly claim that his constitutional rights were being violated, and you can almost see the frustration boiling over in his court filings. Like, he starts throwing around these accusations of fraud and corruption, even pointing fingers at the courts themselves.
Wow, so he wasn't holding back. It's almost like he saw a conspiracy around every corner, like everyone was out to get him.
That's a really important point. You see, without that legal guidance, it's easy to fall into this trap of seeing conspiracies everywhere, interpreting every little setback as proof that the system is rigged against you.
So it's like he's in this echo chamber of his own making.
Yeah.
The more he hits a wall, the more convinced he becomes that there's some grand scheme at play. Did any of his lawsuits actually gain any traction? Did he ever get a win in court?
And this is where it gets really interesting. Because despite his persistence, despite pouring his heart and soul into these arguments, and trust me, the guy could write, the courts consistently ruled against him. Every single lawsuit dismissed.
Every single one. Man, that's got to be demoralizing. To put so much faith in the legal system only to feel like you're constantly hitting a brick wall. What were the legal grounds for dismissing his lawsuits? Like, what were the judges saying?
Well, the courts were very specific in their reasoning, often citing legal doctrines that directly addressed the flaws in Escalante's arguments. One of the most common reasons for dismissal was lack of subject matter jurisdiction.
Okay, jurisdiction. Now we're getting into the legal weeds. Can you break that down for those of us who didn't go to law school?
Sure. Imagine you're trying to order a pizza, right? But instead of calling Domino's, you call, I don't know, a sushi restaurant. No matter how much you plead for a pepperoni pizza, they just can't help you. It's not what they do. They don't have the ingredients, the know-how, you name it. That's kind of like jurisdiction. It's the court's authority to hear a specific type of case.
So, like, small claims court can't rule on an international trade dispute, even if the arguments are compelling.
You got it. And in Escalante's case, a lot of his lawsuits were dismissed because he was bringing his arguments to the wrong court. He was essentially trying to order a pizza from the sushi place.
So even if his claims were true, he was making them in the wrong arena. What about the lawsuits that did fall under the right jurisdiction? Did any of those get past the initial hurdle?
Even then, the courts often found his arguments lacking. They would often cite failure to state a claim as a basis for dismissal.
Failure to state a claim. Okay, now you're just messing with me. What does that even mean?
All right. Imagine someone tries to sue, say, a bakery because they felt sad after not getting a cookie. It's a feeling we can all relate to, sure, but it doesn't hold up in court. You can't just walk in there with hurt feelings. You need to show that a law was actually broken, that you suffered a real, legally recognized harm.
So you're saying Escalante's arguments might have made sense on an emotional level, but they didn't have that legal backing.
Precisely. He might have felt a deep sense of injustice, but he struggled to draw that line between his personal experience and what the law actually says and back it up with evidence. Some judges even called his pleadings conclusory, which basically means he was jumping to conclusions without providing the necessary facts to support his claims.
It's like he was speaking a different language. He had the passion, the raw emotion, but without that shared language of the law, his message was getting lost in translation.
Exactly. A perfect analogy. And unfortunately for Escalante, this communication breakdown had some serious consequences. You see, as his lawsuits piled up and were repeatedly dismissed, the court started to notice. They saw a pattern of what they considered frivolous litigation. And that brings us to the crux of our deep dive today, the filing restrictions that were imposed on Escalante.
Okay, now this is where things get really interesting. These restrictions, they're not something the courts just throw around lightly, are they? What would lead a court to take such a drastic step? Okay, now this is where things get really interesting. These restrictions, they're not something the courts just throw around lightly, are they? What would lead a court to take such a drastic step?
Yeah, you're right. These restrictions are a pretty big deal. I mean, courts are usually hesitant to limit anyone's access to the legal system, right?
Right.
But at the same time, they also have to protect the system itself, make sure it's not getting bogged down by these, frivolous lawsuits that just waste everyone's time and resources.
It's about finding that balance. Access versus responsibility.
Exactly. And in Escalante's case, well, the court started to see a pattern of behavior that just raised all sorts of red flags. His lawsuits, which, by the way, often targeted the same people and organizations over and over again, were constantly getting tossed out on, pretty solid legal grounds.
Right.
It became pretty clear that his goal wasn't really about, winning a legal victory or righting a specific wrong. It was more about, well, maybe harassing those he saw as responsible for his situation. And of course, just venting his frustration with the system as a whole.
So the court basically had to step in to protect itself and everyone else involved in Escalante's cases.
Exactly. The filing restrictions they imposed on him basically mean that now he has to get permission from a judge before he can even file a new lawsuit.
Wow.
So he has to convince the court that his case actually has merit before it even sees the light of day.
That's a high bar to clear.
It is. But, and this is important, it's not about completely silencing him, right? It's about making sure that his right to access the courts doesn't infringe on everyone else's right to, well, not be dragged into pointless legal battles.
So it's this delicate balancing act, and it really makes you think about the bigger picture, doesn't it? The challenges that people face when they represent themselves in court,
Hmm.
especially when they're dealing with a system that can feel, well, let's face it, incredibly complex and intimidating.
It is. And, I think Escalante's case is a good reminder that we need to find ways to make the legal system more user-friendly.
Hmm.
Provide more resources for people who choose to represent themselves, maybe even rethink how we approach certain types of cases, especially ones like family law disputes, which can get so emotionally charged.
Absolutely. Because at the end of the day, justice should be accessible to everyone, not just those who can afford a lawyer or navigate the legal maze on their own. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. This has been a fascinating and frankly kind of sobering look at the challenges of navigating the U.S. legal system. We'll leave you with this question to ponder. How can we make the pursuit of justice more equitable and accessible for everyone, regardless of their legal knowledge or resources? Food for thought.